We'll now talk a little bit more about objects. So the memory space that contains our actual string is what we call a string object. So for example, our earlier statement where we had str equals hello, the memory space that stored hello would be the object of our string class. And we call such string objects instances of the string class. So don't be surprised if the term instance and object interchange. I'll try to use object probably more, but we can say it is an instance or an object of the string class. And using the new operator to create a class object is called instancing an object of that class. So what we're going to see several different examples of working with objects, but it's a very powerful feature in object-oriented programming. So how are objects and variables different from each other? There are some key differences. So we declare a reference variable of a class type. And then we use the new operator to instantiate an object of that particular type. And then we store the address of the object into the reference variable. So an object is not a variable. The only thing that makes them similar to each other is the fact that we have some memory set aside and we store some data in there. But how we access that data is different. With a variable, we can just directly access it with the name of the variable. But with an object, we have an address, and that address is stored in a reference variable, and then we need to use the name of that reference variable to get the address of that memory spot, which contains the memory address of our object, and then we can access our data. So we kind of have to do two memory accesses to find our data, whereas with variables, we only have to do one memory access. Now, we can change the value of a variable by just reassigning it to some different value. But what about objects? Some classes do allow us to change the object. They give us predefined methods to change the data in that object. Unfortunately, the string class is not one such object. Class. It doesn't have any of the predefined methods that let us change the string. So string objects are what we call immutable. So an immutable object means that we just cannot change it once it's created. So then you're probably wondering, okay, if I can't change the object of a string class, then how do I change a string? Well, what we do is we'll just create a new object and assign the address of that object to the reference variable. So for example, I can do str equals hi. And what this will do is it'll create a new object, and this object will have a different address than the memory cell that contained hello. And we store that address in str. And this is the equivalent of changing the value of str, because technically we're changing the memory address of it, or the address of where our data is stored. So now we're going to look at a completely different location in our memory for the string that we want. So if we wanted to illustrate this, we just simply use an arrow instead of trying to display the actual memory addresses, because we don't necessarily know what the addresses are until we run the code. So instead of having two memory cells and saying, okay, the reference variable has an address and this address corresponds to another memory cell, we'll just use an arrow that says that the reference variable corresponds to some object. So we say that a reference variable points to that object. So if you give me an example here, so here on the left side, we'd have our reference variable str, and this would point to our data object, which would be hello in this case. It's worth noting that in some languages, like in C and C++, these reference variables are called pointers, but they do the exact same thing. It's just a variable that contains a memory address, and the memory address itself would give us the value that we're working with. So then the question to ask is, what happens to memory that we no longer use? So we allocate some memory, and then maybe we don't use it anymore. So like in our string example earlier, we created a string object that had hello in it, and then we created another string object that had hi in it, and assigned the memory address of that to our reference variable, which means nothing is no longer being connected or pointing to our hello string object. Now in Java, while the program is running, it will detect these objects that are no longer used. So Java will actually reclaim that memory space. That way it can be used later. And this is what we call garbage collection. Some programming languages like Java do have its own garbage collection. Other languages do not automatically perform garbage collection. You may have to manually enforce that in order to reclaim unused memory.